The old hospital in Park Falls opened in the early 1900s to meet the needs of the lumber industry and has been a part of our community for a little over 100 years. It has served people in Park Falls with care and a place to stay. The old hospital is located on First Avenue North and is currently Park Place Assisted Living. The old hospital is considered a landmark because it changed our whole community. Before the Park Falls Hospital, there was no way for people to get to a doctor unless they wanted to get on a train and travel hours away. That is how the whole Park Falls Hospital started. The first medical doctors were Albert Gibson and George H. Hattie. Dr. Edwin A. Riley and Rose Riley came to Park Falls in 1908. Shortly after they arrived, the Rileys bought the Gilbert Ross residence and turned it into the first Park Falls Hospital. In 1910, Dr. Edwin A. Riley enlarged the residence to have a 4-bed ward, 1 2-bedroom, and 3 private rooms on the first floor. There was also a 16-cot ward and 1 other private room on the second floor. There were 31 beds altogether, a radiology room, and a small operating room. The Park Falls Hospital served as a home for the injured and also the loggers whose homes were too far away. Doctors used to travel all over to care for patients whose homes were close by, yet these residents didn't want to go to the hospital. Some lumber accidents include Joseph Hilgart, who died of multiple head wounds, Charles Englehart, who died falling under a logging train and severed one of his arms, and 17-year-old Oliver Hansen, who lost his legs in the gear wheels of a saw. That is how dangerous this work was. Rose Riley was one of the very few female doctors. Many Eisensteiners liked her since she could speak her own version of their Bohemian language. Dr. Hattie and Dr. Gibson continued working until Dr. W. H. Reamer said he would come and help. Reamer stayed with the Park Falls facility for 7 years. In 1914, Reamer and the Rileys were the only resident doctors in Park Falls. Since Dr. Edwin Riley enlisted in World War I in 1914, Dr. Flowers came and nurtured patients with Dr. Rose Riley during the influenza epidemic of 1918. Dr. Edwin returned and sold the hospital to Dr. Joseph Speck. Dr. Speck hired a young nurse named Maud Murphy. She worked and managed the facility until 1925. It was then purchased by Dr. Justin Leahy of Butternut. Dr. Leahy remodeled the hospital with a new 6-bed ward on the second floor, new radiology equipment, and new diathermy equipment. Diathermy is a surgical technique using the production of heat through a certain part of the body through a high-frequency electrical currents to stimulate the circulation and relieve pain. Dr. Leahy sold the hospital to Maud Murphy, who wished to build a new facility. In the Great Depression, the only choice she had was to remodel the old one. She managed to add a second story with more space, a new delivery room, nursery, minor surgery, and an emergency room. Maud kept the hospital open through the 1930s when unemployment was high. She died in 1941 and her son James took over the hospital. Soon her son enlisted in World War II and his wife Jean ran the hospital until the war was over in 1945. The hospital continued to expand until it was sold to the Park Falls Hospital Association for $13,000 plus $7,000 for the radiology equipment. The Hospital Association was a nonprofit organization with a board of directors who worked maintaining and improving Park Falls health. In the 1950s, land was donated to build new hospitals on Sherry and Linden Avenues. The federal grant was $219,000. Other people gave money too, such as civic groups and private donors as far as Glidden, Butternut, Fifield, and Phillips. 8 years later, Hill Burton Funds donated $173,953,000. An interesting story from the Park Falls Hospital is the story of Ronald Armstrong. He was born in the middle of the road and his family couldn't find him. They didn't know that he was even born. Turns out that one of their neighbors, John Seifert, found the baby in the road and he was returned safely. That is why the Park Falls Hospital started caring for infants and elders. Life at the old hospital was very unique. You knew you were there if you had to push a button to get a doctor, share a room with 3 other patients, or put your clothes in a metal dresser. If you wanted to say, this is what it would be like. In your room, there would be 3 beds and a big metal dresser for you and the other patients in the room. You had only 1 suitcase to hold your belongings, and that was it. All of your things had to fit in 1 drawer of the dresser. If you wanted a doctor, you pushed a button and he came to your room. The doctor brought a doctor's kit, and then he saw what was wrong with you. You may have had to put a mercury thermometer in your mouth and wait 5 minutes for it to rise. Then after that, the doctor would leave to treat another patient. If you were a nurse, you would wear a soft nurse's cape and a hat. You would carry first aid kits. In the first aid kits, there was gauze, aspirin, and a few bandages. There was also medicine for toothaches that smelled like clove. You may have also brought a glass urinal to patients. In those days, a glass urinal was used for measuring urine and vomit. There was also a small nurse's book filled with all the answers to every question. Patients at the old hospital ate what they wanted to eat. Sometimes late in the night, nurses would make popcorn for all of the patients. People only ate real food, not processed. There are many stories that are told, but the stories of Pauline Mason and Henry Brown are really interesting. Pauline Mason would have trouble sleeping, so she would wake up in the middle of the night and shout, "Hello!" Pauline and the nurse would talk through a device that looked like a French horn because she was hard of hearing. The story of Henry Brown is that he came with only a fiddle. He wanted food and a place to stay. Henry used to put vinegar on everything to ensure that he wasn't being poisoned. In 1968, the Park Falls Ambulance Service was formed. The ambulance provided a way to get patients to bigger facilities that were farther away. All the drivers needed was a driver's license and a first aid card. The first drivers were Art Pritzel, Earl Gunderson, Fred Patterson, and Gary Knotts. The first call was on Christmas Day, 1968. Pritzel and Gunderson drove the ambulance. In the 1970s, the state of Wisconsin raised the requirements for the drivers. They had to pass an 81-hour technician test. They also had semi-annual disaster drills. In 1973, John Wright, Perry Reese, and Irv Schwartz were the first to pass the test and became EMTs. In 1977, the Park Falls Hospital changed its name to Flambeau Medical. In 1979, the hospital was remodeled again with new beds, 33 surgical rooms, a laboratory, radiology, respiratory therapy, an emergency room, and business and admitting offices. The ambulance service, the first responder system, started in the 1980s for people in rural areas. Because the ambulance and responders showed up faster, there were more lives that they were able to save. Through the years, the Park Falls Hospital has changed many different times. This building has served many different purposes for all of the patients. Whether the patients came for food, shelter, or were injured, the Park Falls Hospital made them feel at home. Flambeau Medical has a lot of interesting history behind it. You can learn even more about this historical landmark by visiting the building and Park Falls. Without this facility, we wouldn't have medical care in Park Falls today.